When I think about Matthew 6, considering the lilies, I also think about this passage which precedes it, Matthew 5. And what was Jesus trying to teach us in this passage, in this journey that he was inviting us to. And I have been talking about this passage as part of a theological inquiry into cultural care. I won't go into too much in detail here, but it really starts out with this idea of common good, or since we're in Pennsylvania, we can use the word commonwealth. There was a time when public discourse was dictated by commonwealth. The idea that everything that we do in politics, in business, in culture, was for commonwealth. And so this passage, which is used as a passage that many Christians have termed common grace, for he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. So the idea is that, it's snowing. It's annoying for both people who follow God and who don't care about God. Or maybe it's beautiful for those who may not go to church, but they can actually stop and admire the beauty of the snow. So that's the idea, is that God's grace is so immanent, so universal, right? But when we talk about this passage, we often don't mention that this is predicated upon something else. This idea of common space is predicated upon Christians, followers of Christ, to be able to do the command which comes before this passage. And that is to love your enemies. Do good to those who persecute you. Pray for them. And this leads into considering the lilies passage, because this idea of loving your enemies, this impossibility of it, requires imagination. Love requires imagination. You cannot love somebody without imagination. You know that on your first date. You have to use your imagination, as the hotel lady said. Right? I'm going to skip a few passages here, and because I want to get to Emily. I went to see, why is it doing this? Okay. Yesterday I was in New York with my wife, and there was this revival, staging of The Belle of Amherst, a wonderful play about Emily Dickinson. And my wife thinks I'm having an affair with her. And so I told her that, we can go together. And so this is my studio in Princeton. I moved out of the city 2 years ago, and actually my wife forced me to, but we won't go there. And I started. For the first time, I am starting to garden. So I wanted to share this photo with you. On the left is the reproduced garden of Emily Dickinson, that New York Botanical garden put together. This was my garden this summer. I've never gotten before, so I'm learning a lot. But the one thing that I did notice from Emily's garden is that she actually did practice what she preached. She did consider the lilies and the zinnias and all sorts of plants, tulips, and she grew what she can cut. So her labor will become a gift to her world. So I thought about Emily, and I thought about Matthew 5 and Matthew 6. I thought about common grace, and thinking about what I wanted to share with you tonight. And I thought about this poem of hers. Now, Emily is not a standard bearer of theological precision, but she is nevertheless someone that I think is extraordinarily important for our journey. And I hope in these remaining minutes that you will see why she's so important. Why she is important for us, both from the theological territory to the aesthetic, to your life, struggling with anxiety, dealing with the day-to-day Darwinian struggle that we're in, that Emily Dickinson, I am proposing, is one of the antidotes that we need to hear. This poem is not an easy poem, but I want to kind of probe into it and show you some things in this poem, because I think it can actually reveal both everything that I've been talking about, and why this disengagement from reading, this disengagement from culture, this disengagement from the lilies of the field, why we are actually in need of her words. So let me read this to you. I'm going to read this several times, and I think you might know this, but if you're reading a poem, read it out loud. Read it several times. Again, just like my work, it takes about 10 minutes before your mind is at rest and you don't hear these words. Those not live yet, who doubt to live again is of twice, but this is one. The ship beneath the draw aground is he. Death. So the hyphen of the sea. Deep is a schedule of the disk to be. Costumeless consciousness, that is he. I've been writing about Emily for about 3 years now, and I didn't know what it was going to become, and I kept on writing, and it keeps growing. So I'm going to share a little bit of it here with you. Notice these hyphens, okay? There are many hyphens here. Her poems are filled with hyphens and dashes. So these dashes were important to her. They held some significance as a liminal device, floating, right? The dashes can divide, but they float in between the structure of the poem itself. They hover, they create this hovering effect, perhaps even as a little horizon between heaven and earth. I don't know. Between the spirit and the material, perhaps. These hyphens are, to her, this poetic expression that signifies something, and I began to think that she identified with these hyphens herself. That she saw that a poet is like a hyphen, a dash. Quiet, surprising intrusion, even an agitating pause. And it is tempting, isn't it, if you're an editor like Thomas Higginson, who first got Emily Dickinson's poem. She sent it to him in Boston. And he suggested that he would like to remove these dashes. And she was devastated. Dashes were important to her. This pause. Something that society wants to edit out. That was her. But structurally, if you read this poem, it is the most needed pause, the sanity in the chaotic dance of life and death. She's talking about life and death here. So this hyphen of the sea she's describing is something that she's trying to carve out, a liminal space perhaps, that she's trying to carve out in this oppressed reality that she's seeing all about her. And I think she's intuiting something about the world to come as well in 20th century. And she actually did not publish, except Mr. Higginson did manage to publish her poems, but by removing the dashes and turning her half rhymes into full rhymes. She published anonymously, but she never tried again. And I was illuminating these texts of the Bible, and I realized too that Emily Dickinson was an illuminator too. She was illuminating something between the margins of her words, and the dashes give her that holding place for the irreducible reality that she was experiencing in life. So when she writes those not live yet, it's a forced reading. It's not those who live yet. It's those not live yet who doubt to live again. Okay? Her words are moving in and out of a threshold, planting into this terrain of darkness. And she's trying to elevate them, to force us to pay attention to these words. Here, the cadence of the poem makes me, at least, read the first live as alive. So those not live yet. I almost want to include that A in the first line. Her words forced me to cross a threshold and forced me to read the second line thinking about the first line, who doubt to live again. We have a visual rhyme here, accentuated by the repetition, reinforced by the next line, which says, again is over twice, but this dash is one. A is repeated and forced, as in the first line, first stanza. Remember the live, becoming alive in my mind. And here, again, is echoing that visual reminder there. And we're forced to add this invisible A in the first line, but then we think of the word again, repeated here, again and again, kind of a pun, humor. But when we think about these words, right, and these dashes, we have to remember that all around her is this reality of the Civil War happening. These young men from Amherst being sent off and often coming back in coffins. These young men, were like ships that never left the harbor, youth whose lives are never allowed to become alive. And again, it happens. These funerals in the main streets of Amherst, again. Without the A, we are merely live, incomplete and never alive. And if you remove the A from A, again, it's a little confusing, but it becomes gain, right? So these words have significance, and she's actually playing with these words. And for a person struggling with her faith, it seems so amazing that she actually gets to the heart of the resurrection. Life is taken up in death to be with God and reunited with the body when heaven and earth will be fused again. Is of twice. Echoing this great theologian of our time, N.T. Wright, right? Who beautifully said, in a strained expression to speak of the mystery of the resurrection, he says, it is the life after death. So for Dickinson, such promise is fully understood, not just from the perspective of faith, but also from the perspective of doubt. So, who doubt to live again. And such mental vacillation makes her hard to pin down ideologically and theologically, and they're often hijacked by ideological writers. But look at this, what's happening as she develops this. She says, and I think you noticed me struggling with this passage here, death, right? So the hyphen of the sea. Deep is a schedule, which is another fourth rhyme, of the disk to be, costumeless consciousness, which echoes the schedule that is he, dash. So in this poem, she's calling death, dash, soul, dash, hyphen of the sea. The very definition of the hyphen, she suspends between the hyphens. Like the names of the dead, they are caught between reality and imagination, between life and death, between clarity and ambiguity. And these dashes, they do break the flow of the words, but they also create another form of visual poetry. Hyphens themselves are like stitches weaving in and out of her liquid words, designed to hold all things together. They burrow in and out of the garden of her poems like moles, allowing our eyes to shift, focus, to dance, and to point out the subterranean reality of her poems. These delicate and combative words come to us before the bloodshed of Auschwitz and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I say they are ground zero poems. They stand out in our time, not in the periphery, like we assume poetry and art to be, but at the heart of the gaping wounds of our days and the days to come. So, hyphen of the sea is what points to the customless consciousness. Hyphens were her most idiosyncratic invention, a vision of a poet. And I think hyphens represent to her this common space. Things that we deem dispensable, things that we do not value anymore in our time, things that makes us perhaps extravagant and gratuitous, things that makes us pause, things that makes us stop and actually pay attention to what is in front of us. Emily Dickinson's poem reminds me, at least, that such a thing can penetrate even the most anxious heart. And so I indulge myself by placing her words, indelible words, next to my work. Because I wanted this imagination to affect me, even as I speak today. I wanted this life, which was discarded in a way, never seen as important. Her voice still ring in my mind as one of the most important voices of American literature. You know, and when you think about Emily Dickinson's life, it's the most on-purpose-driven life. There is no, she would not fit into the programs of our days, right? And yet, I think increasingly, you know, as we find ourselves operating this reality, this anxious-filled reality, I think we need her words. I was gardening once last winter, and you know that you must till the soil before the winter comes, right? If you're a farmer. So I was tilling the soil in November, so exactly last year, and picked up the dirt. I like to not use gloves because I like to feel the dirt. And I realized something. I realized what Emily was talking about, and I realized what Jesus was talking about at the same time. I realized what the soil was. Soil is made up of layers and layers of death. That's what a soil is. All these plants that went through their seasons and spent themselves and they die. Insects that burrow in and out of them. Maybe animals, birds, maybe us. Soil is made up of layers and layers of death. And if you're like Emily, who see that, and who write poems to inject something generative into that ground, or if you're like my friend Christian Wyman, who has come so close to death that he can say this: we live in and by our senses, which are conditioned in and by our deaths. An artist is a gardener of the soil of culture. And you can be too. You can choose to till the soil, when it is winter, when you don't see anything happening, when it's cold, things look bleak. But these are the moments, right, when we can actually train our imagination and activate your faith. Plant those bulbs. Because you know that if you till the soil and the soil is full of nurture, then it's going to take root and there will be a spring. Those tulips and irises are going to come up. But we have to train our imagination, till that soil of imagination. And so culture care is about that journey. I look forward to sharing more about that. Thank you very much.